Symfony 2.2 comes with hostname handling out of the box, which lets you create two routes that have the same path but respond to two different subdomains. The base host comes from a value in parameters.yaml, which makes this all even more flexible. But what if you're creating a site that has dynamic subdomains, where each subdomain is a row in a site database table? In this case, the new host routing feature won't help us. It's really meant for handling a finite number of concrete subdomains. So how could this be handled? Let's find out together. Before you go anywhere, make sure you have an Apache virtual host or Nginx site that sends all the subdomains of your host to your application. Since we're using lolnomals.l locally, we'll want star.lolnomals.l to be handled by the vhost. Next, add a few entries to your etc host file for subdomains that we can play with. Restart or reload your web server, and then at least check that you can hit your application from any of these subdomains. So far, our application isn't actually doing any logic with these subdomains, but we'll get there. Next, let's use Doctrine to generate a new site entity, which will store all the information about each individual subdomain. Give the entity a name of QA Day Bundle Site, which uses a QA Day bundle that I already created. For fields, add one called subdomain and two others called name and description, so we at least have some basic information about this site. Finish up the wizard, then immediately create the database and schema. Be sure to customize your app config parameters.yaml file first. Finally, to make things interesting, I'll bring in a little data file that will add two site records into the database. A better way to do this is with some real fixtures files, but this will work for now. This script bootstraps Symfony, but then lets us write custom code beneath it. If you're curious about this script or fixtures, check out our Starting in Symfony 2 series, where we cover all this goodness and a ton more. Execute the script from the command line. I'll use the built-in Doctrine Query SQL command to double-check that things work. Great! Let's get to the good stuff. Because of our virtual host, our application already responds to every subdomain of lolnomals.l. The goal in our code is to be able to determine based on the hostname which site record in the database is being used. First, let's use a homepage route and controller that I've already created. This will seem simple, but for now, let's determine which site record is being used by querying directly here. I'll add the $request as an argument to the method and get the request object. Then use getHost to grab the hostname. Dump the value to see that it's working. The value stored in the database is actually only the subdomain part, not the whole hostname. In other words, we need to transform alpacas.lolnomals.l into simply alpacas before querying. Fortunately, I've already stored my base host as a parameter in parameters.yaml. By grabbing this value out of the container and doing some simple string manipulation, we can get the current subdomain key. Perfect! Now querying for the current site is pretty easy. We'll also assume that we need a valid subdomain. So let's show a 404 page if we can't find the site. Finally, pass the site into the template so we can prove we're matching the right one. Dump some basic information out in the template to celebrate. Okay, try it out. The alpacas and kittens subdomains work perfectly. But the dinos subdomain causes a 404, since there's no entry in the database for it. This is simple and functional, but let's do better. We've met our requirements of dynamic subdomains, but it's not very pretty yet. We'll probably need to know what the current site is all over the place in our code, in every controller and in other places like services. And we certainly don't want to repeat all of this code. That would be crazy. Let's fix this step by step. First, create a new class called Site Manager, which will be responsible for always knowing what the current site is. The class is very simple, just a property with a getSet method. Next, register this as a service. If services are a newer concept for you, we cover them extensively in episode 3 of our Symfony 2 series. I'll create a new services.yaml file in my bundle. The actual service configuration couldn't be simpler. This file is new, so make sure it's imported. I'll import it by adding a new imports entry to config.yaml. Sweet! Run container debug to make sure things are working. Perfect! So, how does this help us? First, let's set the current site on the Site Manager from within our controller. Don't let this step confuse you, because it's pretty underwhelming. This sets the current site on the Site Manager, which we use immediately to pass to the template. If this looks kinda dumb to you, it is! Getting the current site from the Site Manager is cool, but the problem is that we still need to set this manually. In other words, the Site Manager is only one piece of the solution. Now let's add an event listener to fix the rest. Somehow, we need to be able to move the logic that determines the current site out of the controller and to some central location. To do this, we'll leverage an event listener. Again, if this is new to you, we cover it in episode 3 of our Symfony 2 series. First, create the listener class. Let's call it current site listener and set it to have the Site Manager and Doctrines Entity Manager injected as dependencies. Let's also inject the base host parameter. We'll need it here as well. The goal of this class is to determine and set the current site at the very beginning of every request, before your controller is executed. Create a method called onKernelRequest with a single event argument, which is an instance of getResponseEvent. Before we fill in the rest of this method, register the listener as a service and tag it so that it's an event listener on the kernel request event. And with that, let's try it. When we refresh the page, we can see the message that proves that our new listener is being called early in Symfony's Bootstrap. With all that behind us, let's fill in the final step. In the onKernelRequest method, our goal is to determine and set the current site. Copy the logic out of our controller into this method, then tweak things to hook up. The differences here are a bit subtle. For example, the base host is now stored in a property, and we can get Doctrine's repository through the EM property. We've also replaced the createNotFound exception call by instantiating a new NotFound HTTP exception instance. The createNotFound exception method lives in Symfony's base controller. We don't have access to it here, but this is actually what it really does behind the scenes. Since we've registered this as an event listener on the kernel request event, this method will guarantee that the site manager has a current site before our controller is ever executed. This means we can get rid of almost all of the code in our controller. Try it out. Sweet, it still works. We can now use the site manager from anywhere in our code to get the current site object. For example, if we needed to load all the blog posts for only this site, we could grab the current site, then create a query that returns only those items. Basically, from here, you can be dangerous.